First, like this video, hit subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Imagine standing in a bustling 14th century London street, the air heavy with the scent of human and animal waste, mingled with the decay of rotting refuse. This was the medieval reality, a stark contrast to our modern, sanitation-conscious world. The very ground beneath your feet would likely be slick with a putrid concoction, making passage treacherous and disease rampant. This pervasive filth wasn't just an aesthetic inconvenience. It was a public health crisis that medieval authorities grappled with through a surprising array of laws, often born out of sheer necessity. Consider the heart of any medieval town, the market. While essential for daily life, it was also a prime source of urban squalor. Research by Dr. Carol Rawcliffe, a specialist in medieval medicine and urban history, highlights how animal carcasses, offal, and decaying produce were routinely discarded directly onto public thoroughfares. This wasn't merely careless. Regulations were often poorly enforced, or in some cases, non-existent. For instance, in York in 1370, a bylaw was enacted specifically forbidding the dumping of dung and other corruptible things into the River Ouse, a primary water source, reflecting an awareness, however rudimentary, of contamination risks. Previously, such practices were commonplace. The consequences were dire and quantifiable. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, saw mortality rates soar, with historians often attributing its devastating spread, in part, to these unsanitary conditions. While the precise vectors of plague transmission were unknown at the time, the correlation between densely populated, unhygienic environments and widespread disease was undeniable to contemporary observers. Chroniclers lamented the great stench that preceded outbreaks. To combat this, medieval cities implemented ordinances that might seem bizarre by today's standards. In 1388, the English Parliament passed an act that was remarkably forward-thinking for its era, prohibiting the disposal of dung and filth into rivers and ditches because the air is thereby greatly corrupted and infected, and many maladies and other intolerable diseases do daily happen. This wasn't just about appearance. It was an early, if imperfect, attempt at public health legislation. Householders in many towns were legally obliged to clean the street in front of their property. Failure to do so could result in fines, as records from Bristol and Norwich demonstrate. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a wider, albeit slow, evolution in urban consciousness regarding sanitation. The laws, however strange in their specific prohibitions, were a vital response to a deeply ingrained and dangerous problem, shaping rudimentary public health systems for centuries to come. Despite the seemingly overwhelming challenge of medieval filth, a surprising ingenuity emerged amidst the squalor. While the immediate objective of waste management laws was public health, they inadvertently fostered innovative solutions, turning foul problems into unexpected opportunities for economic benefit and urban development. The very refuse that choked the streets sometimes became a valuable commodity. Consider the role of scavengers and rakers. Chronicled in accounts from cities like London as early as the 13th century, these individuals weren't merely street sweepers. They were integral to an embryonic recycling economy. Filth, particularly animal dung, was highly prized as fertilizer for surrounding agricultural lands. Historian Pamela Sambrook notes that contracts for waste removal often stipulated that the collected matter be transported outside city walls, demonstrating a clear understanding of its value to farmers. This wasn't merely disposal, it was redistribution. For instance, in 1357, Parliamentary records indicate London authorities paid men to clear the streets and docks, but these same individuals were permitted to sell the collected soil for profit, offsetting the city's expenses. Beyond agriculture, specific types of waste held unique value. The ordure from latrines, particularly human excrement, became a key component in early industrial processes. Tanners and fullers, for instance, relied on urine and feces for their work. Urine, rich in ammonia, was crucial for degreasing wool and softening hides. Records from medieval Florence describe specific collection points for urine, indicating a structured system for reclaiming this seemingly repulsive byproduct. This practice, while odorous, underpinned significant industries, providing employment and contributing to urban economies. Even discarded building materials found new life. Rubble from demolished structures was often reused in new construction, a practical and sustainable approach in an era without readily available mass-produced materials. Archaeological digs in medieval urban centres frequently uncover evidence of such recycling, from repurposed stones to broken pottery integrated into building foundations. These ostensibly crude and often unpleasant practices illustrate a foundational truth. Necessity is the mother of invention. Medieval cities, faced with daunting sanitation challenges, slowly developed a pragmatic, if often crude, system for waste management. These laws and the resulting practices were not just about removing unpleasantries. They were about resourcefulness, establishing early economic cycles that capitalized on what we now consider waste, showcasing a remarkable resilience and adaptability in the face of urban growth and its inherent problems. The laws compelling waste removal, therefore, served a dual purpose: mitigating immediate health risks and, perhaps unintentionally, fostering a nascent circular economy. From the pervasive stench of urban filth, we now turn our attention to another peculiar aspect of medieval society: the rigorous control over what people wore and ate. Imagine a world where your daily attire, the fabric of your cloak, or even the number of dishes served at your banquet, was dictated by law. These were sumptuary laws, seemingly trivial regulations that, upon closer inspection, reveal a deep-seated anxiety about social order and economic stability in the Middle Ages. Sumptuary laws were primarily designed to reinforce the hierarchical structure of medieval society, making social status immediately recognizable through outward appearance. Dr. Catherine L. French, a historian specializing in medieval social and cultural history, emphasizes that clothing was a powerful nonverbal indicator of rank, wealth, and moral standing. For example, in 1363, England's Parliament enacted a comprehensive sumptuary statute. This law meticulously detailed what materials and colours various social classes could wear. Knights, their wives and children were permitted cloth of gold or silver, silk or fur, but commoners, tradesmen, and yeomen were strictly forbidden from wearing ermine, pearls, or cloth of gold. They were often restricted to simpler woolens and linens. The reasons behind these restrictions were manifold. Firstly, they aimed to curb excessive spending, especially among the rising merchant class. After the Black Death, a labour shortage led to increased wages for commoners, who then began to imitate the finery of the nobility. This challenged the traditional social order. The 1363 English statute explicitly states its intent to prevent outrageous and excessive apparel spreading to persons of small estate who were spending more than they may spend. This was not just snobbery. It was an attempt to stabilize an economy still reeling from demographic collapse and shifting wealth. Secondly, these laws served a moral function, addressing concerns about vanity and sin. Medieval theologians often preached against pride and extravagance, viewing elaborate dress as a sign of moral decay. The Church, a powerful institution, actively supported legislation that promoted temperance and humility, often influencing secular rulers to enact such laws. Finally, sumptuary laws functioned as a form of social control, preventing ambiguity of status. In a society where birth largely determined one's place, visual cues reinforced this structure. If a peasant could dress like a lord, the very fabric of society, both literally and figuratively, might begin to unravel. These regulations, therefore, were not merely about fashion. They were critical tools for maintaining the rigid class distinctions and the overall stability of a precarious medieval world. If clothes defined status, then food, particularly bread, defined survival. In the medieval world, bread was the primary staple, constituting 70 and 80% of an average person's diet. Its availability and quality were not just matters of personal preference, but critically intertwined with public order and the very stability of daily life. This vital role of bread led to another set of seemingly hyper-regulatory medieval laws, aimed at controlling its production and price. These were the Assize of Bread and Ale, first formally codified in England around 1266. This groundbreaking piece of legislation established a sliding scale, linking the price of bread to the price of wheat, ensuring bakers could make a reasonable profit while protecting consumers from price gouging. Dr. Martha Carlin, a historian specializing in medieval food history, notes that this assize was one of the earliest and most enduring examples of price control in English history, remaining in effect, with modifications, for centuries. It directly dictated the weight of a loaf of bread based on the cost of grain. If wheat became expensive, loaves became smaller, but their price remained stable. The implications of this were profound. Food scarcity, particularly of bread, was a direct catalyst for riots and social unrest. A hungry populace was a dangerous populace. By regulating the bread market, authorities sought to prevent widespread famine and maintain peace. Bakers who cheated on weights or adulterated their flour faced severe penalties, including fines, public shaming, and even the pillory. Picture a baker, hands nailed to his own counter, as a warning to others contemplating fraud. In some cases, repeat offenders faced banishment from the town. These punishments were not arbitrary. They served as powerful deterrents against actions that directly threatened public welfare. Moreover, the assize also addressed quality. Bakers were forbidden from mixing inferior grains with finer flours or using old, spoiled ingredients. This attention to detail reflects a surprisingly advanced understanding of public health, ensuring that communities had access to wholesome, if not always palatable, sustenance. The complexity of these regulations suggests a deep official concern for the fundamental well-being of their subjects, understanding that a steady supply of affordable quality bread was paramount. These laws, therefore, were far more than simple price controls. They were instruments of social stabilization, economic regulation, and, in a basic sense, public health. They demonstrate a recognition that the foundational needs of the populace, chief among them, food, had to be protected, even through strict and intrusive legislation, to prevent chaos and maintain the delicate balance of medieval society. The price of a loaf of bread, in essence, was the price of peace. From the fundamental needs of sustenance, we shift to the regulation of time itself, specifically the fall of night. Imagine a medieval town as dusk descends. As the last rays of sun vanish, a profound shift occurs. the streets empty, the vibrant daytime hustle falls silent, and a deep, often unsettling darkness envelops everything. This transformation was not merely a natural phenomenon, it was enforced by law. The medieval curfew, signalled by the ringing of a community bell, was a pervasive and intrusive regulation with surprisingly practical, sometimes even benevolent origins. The word curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. This directly points to one of its primary functions, fire prevention. In medieval towns and cities, buildings were predominantly constructed from highly flammable materials like wood, wattle and daub, and thatch. Open flames from hearths, candles, and workshops posed an enormous and constant threat. A single ember could quickly engulf an entire neighborhood. Dr. Virginia Scharf, a historian specializing in urban studies, notes that devastating urban fires were a commonplace and terrifying reality throughout the Middle Ages, often wiping out large sections of cities. Thus, the evening bell, typically ringing around 8 or 9 p.m., served as a mandatory signal for all citizens to extinguish their fires, cover their embers, and put out lamps. This was not merely a suggestion, it was law, rigorously enforced. Those found with uncovered fires or excessive light after the curfew bell could face significant fines or even imprisonment. Records from medieval London and Paris indicate specific night watches, whose duties included patrolling streets for fire hazards. Beyond fire safety, curfews served as a critical tool for maintaining public order and safety. Medieval streets, poorly lit if at all, became havens for crime after dark. The absence of effective street lighting made theft, assault, and other illicit activities far easier to perpetrate and harder to detect. By clearing the streets, authorities aimed to reduce opportunities for crime and ease the task of night watches. A decree from Augsburg in 1276 explicitly stated that no citizen or inhabitant shall venture out on the streets after the ringing of the last bell, without a light, and if found, they shall be apprehended. Therefore, these silent bells were not solely oppressive measures, but pragmatic responses to the very real dangers of medieval urban life. They embodied a communal effort to protect property and life from constant threats, demonstrating a societal commitment to order, security, and fire prevention in a precarious world. The curfew, an emblem of medieval control, was born from a fundamental need for survival in an age before streetlights and fire brigades. Beyond the tangible threats of fire and crime, the medieval night held more abstract, yet equally potent, fears. In a world steeped in superstition and religious dogma, the darkness was also seen as a realm where moral boundaries blurred, where hidden vices could flourish, and where the forces of evil might hold sway. The ubiquitous medieval curfew, while pragmatic in its fire safety and crime reduction aspects, also served a deeper societal function. It was a tool for moral regulation and the reinforcement of communal values. Historian Teofilo F. Ruiz, in his work on medieval mentalities, highlights the pervasive anxiety surrounding the nighttime hours. Without artificial light, the nocturnal world was largely unknown, and therefore easily associated with sin, illicit activities, and supernatural phenomena. Taverns, brothels, and gambling houses, often operating outside the moral confines of daylight society, were subject to specific regulations and closures after the curfew bell. For example, many city ordinances, such as those found in 14th century Paris, stipulated that no innkeeper shall keep their doors open after the curfew bell has rung, nor allow any customer to remain. This control wasn't just about reducing drunken brawls. It was about preventing what was considered moral decay. The curfew also played a role in social control and surveillance, particularly in times of political instability or during periods of epidemic. As Dr. Annemarie Kinzelbach, a researcher on medieval urban governance, points out, clearing the streets after dark made it easier for night watchmen to identify strangers, vagrants, or individuals with suspicious intentions. During outbreaks of plague or other diseases, curfews could also function as a primitive form of quarantine, limiting movement and interaction to slow contagion, a measure seen during the Black Death lockdowns in some European cities. While these measures may appear overly restrictive, they provided a sense of security and order in a precarious existence. The curfew offered a structured rhythm to daily life, distinguishing the productive hours of day from the contained and ideally safe hours of night. It reinforced the idea that the community was protected, both physically and morally, by its authorities. This sense of collective safety, albeit enforced, brought a measure of comfort in an era where life was often short, brutal, and unpredictable. Ultimately, the medieval curfew's intricate web of reasons, from preventing devastating fires and curbing crime to regulating morality and fostering social cohesion, reveals a nuanced understanding of governance. It demonstrates how seemingly draconian laws were responses to genuine fears and necessities, providing a crucial framework for order and protection in a world where the line between natural danger and supernatural threat was often blurred, and control over darkness was paramount. From the control of time and physical space, we now pivot to the very bedrock of medieval commerce: currency. Imagine engaging in trade, only to find the coins in your purse are not what they seem, rendering your hard-earned goods worthless. In an era where coins were often the sole medium of exchange, the integrity of currency was paramount. This vulnerability led to some of the Middle Age's most brutal laws, those against counterfeiting and clipping. The severity of these punishments reflects not just a passion for justice, but a profound understanding of how easily economic stability could be undermined by fraudulent coinage. Counterfeiting and coin clipping, the practice of shaving off small amounts of precious metal from the edges of coins, were considered capital offences throughout much of medieval Europe. Dr. Nicholas J. Mayhew, an expert in medieval numismatics, underscores that the coin was not merely a medium of exchange. It was a physical representation of the monarch's authority and a guarantor of value. Tampering with it was, therefore, an act of treason against the crown and an assault on the economy. The consequences for such crimes were horrific, designed to be public spectacles and powerful deterrents. In England, the punishment for counterfeiting was often drawing and hanging, and for women, being burned at the stake. In 1278, under King Edward III, a monumental investigation led to the arrest of hundreds of Jews and Christians across England on charges of coin clipping. Over 300 Jews were executed, marking one of the most severe crackdowns on currency fraud in medieval history. This demonstrates the state's ruthless determination to protect its economic infrastructure. The impact of debased or clipped coinage was far-reaching. It eroded trust in commercial transactions, making merchants hesitant to accept coins and leading to price inflation. If the value of money was uncertain, trade would grind to a halt, devastating local and international economies. It could destabilize entire kingdoms, undermining a monarch's credibility and triggering social unrest, much like the fear of food shortages. Therefore, these draconian laws, seemingly disproportionate to the crime, had a surprisingly practical foundation. They were not simply acts of vengeance, but critical measures to safeguard economic stability uphold royal authority, and maintain public confidence in the monetary system. In a world without complex banking systems or digital currency, the physical coin was everything. Its purity was a matter of survival for the state and its subjects. The weight of trust, literally and figuratively, rested on its metallic integrity. The stringent laws against currency tampering were not merely punitive. They were a systemic response to the inherent fragility of medieval economies. Unlike today, where central banks can manage inflation and regulate currency supply, medieval rulers had far fewer mechanisms to control economic fluctuations. The purity and standardization of coinage were their primary economic levers, making any threat to it an existential concern. The concept of good money was central to medieval economic thought. A good coin had a consistent weight and fineness of precious metal, gold or silver, and its face value accurately reflected its intrinsic metallic value. Merchants, traveling across kingdoms and encountering diverse currencies, relied on this intrinsic value far more than any stamped effigy. Dr. Philip de Leader, a historian of the High and Late Middle Ages, points out that the process of verifying coins was itself a common visible practice. Money changers equipped with scales and touchstones would meticulously weigh and test coins, often biting them to gauge their metallic content. This constant vigilance against fraud made coinage highly susceptible to disruption from clipping or counterfeiting. Consider the practical implications of a debased currency. If a merchant accepted a handful of clipped silver pennies for a consignment of valuable wool, only to find their true metallic worth significantly diminished, their livelihood would be jeopardized. This could cascade through the economy, leading to a loss of confidence in money itself. People would revert to bartering or hoarding precious metals, halting trade and stifling economic growth. The state, which collected taxes and paid its armies in specie, would find its revenues devalued, thus weakening its administrative and military power. The harsh penalties, therefore, served to protect the very infrastructure of medieval prosperity. The image of a coiner publicly dismembered for his transgression was meant to instill terror, ensuring that few would dare to compromise the monetary system. While brutal by modern standards, these laws were rational within their historical context, demonstrating a clear prioritization of economic stability over individual liberties when the very survival of the state was perceived to be at stake. The fight against counterfeiting was a continuous battle, waged with extreme measures to ensure that the coin, the heartbeat of the medieval economy, continued to ring true. It illustrates a fundamental understanding that a trustworthy currency is the bedrock of any functioning society. From the tangible threat of debased currency, we now turn to a more elusive, yet equally vexing challenge for medieval authorities: the problem of those without fixed abode. Imagine a landscape scarred by famine, plague, and war, where entire populations were dislodged from their traditional homes. The wandering poor and unemployed, branded as vagrants, became an object of suspicion and fear, prompting the enactment of severe laws that, while seemingly cruel, stemmed from a desperate attempt to maintain social order and economic stability in a turbulent world. Vagrancy laws emerged with particular force after the Black Death in the mid-14th century. The catastrophic loss of life, estimated at 30 to 50% of Europe's population, created an unprecedented labor shortage. This paradoxically empowered surviving laborers who demanded higher wages and better conditions, often abandoning their traditional manorial ties to seek better opportunities. Landowners and the ruling elite, desperate to maintain the pre-plague social and economic structure, saw this mobility as a direct threat. Dr. Barbara A. Hannawalt, a leading scholar of medieval English social history, explains that these vagrancy statutes were primarily designed to force able-bodied individuals back into agricultural labor at fixed pre-plague wages. The English Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1349 and subsequently reinforced, explicitly dictated that all able-bodied persons under 60, not otherwise employed, must work for whoever required them. Those refusing could be imprisoned. If they fled, they could be branded or put in the stocks. This legislation, while attempting to stabilize the labor market, inadvertently criminalized unemployment and poverty. People who genuinely could not find work or were too ill to perform heavy labor were still swept up in these harsh measures. Beyond economic control, vagrancy laws also reflected profound anxieties about crime and social disorder. Without a fixed master or known residence, vagrants were perceived as being outside the traditional social hierarchy and therefore inherently untrustworthy and morally suspect. They were seen as potential thieves, beggars, and carriers of disease, further fueling the desire to control their movement. Orders from towns across Europe, from Florence to Frankfurt, show repeated attempts to expel undesirables and masterless men, not just for economic reasons, but also for perceived threats to civic peace and morality. These laws, while creating immense hardship for the vulnerable, illustrate the medieval state's deep-seated need for control. In a society where every individual was ideally tied to a specific place and a specific lord, those who deviated from this norm represented an unseen enemy, a destabilizing force that had to be contained. The illusion of safety for the settled populace came at the cost of criminalizing movement and poverty, reflecting a world grappling with profound demographic and social upheaval. The relentless scrutiny faced by medieval vagrants was not simply punitive. It was a deeply ingrained aspect of a society struggling to define itself in the wake of cataclysmic change. For those whose lives were uprooted by poverty, famine, or war, the road was often the only option, yet it was a path fraught with danger and legal peril. These laws, while harsh, reflect a complex interplay of fear, necessity, and a rudimentary social welfare system, struggling to cope with unprecedented mobility. Historian Michel Mollard du Jourdain, in his comprehensive studies of poverty in the Middle Ages, illustrates that not all vagrants were viewed with equal suspicion. Pilgrims, merchants, and journeymen traveling for legitimate reasons often carried letters of passage or were identifiable by their distinctive attire, affording them some protection. However, the line between legitimate traveller and sturdy beggar was often thin and subject to local interpretation. The critical distinction lay in whether one could justify their presence and movement. If unable to provide a satisfactory reason, one faced immediate judgment. For the genuine poor, survival often depended on a delicate balance of charity and evasion. Monasteries and some wealthy households offered alms, but these resources were limited and often targeted only the deserving poor, those unable to work due to age, illness, or disability. The able-bodied poor, however, were increasingly seen as shirkers. This distinction became embedded in the law. For instance, the 1388 English statute stipulated that no servant or labourer nor beggar shall go or wander out of the 100 administrative district without a letter of testimony. This meant even legitimate travel required official sanction. These laws, therefore, inadvertently created a constant, pervasive surveillance state for anyone outside the immediate and known community. Every footprint in the mud was scrutinized. A lone figure on the road might be a potential labourer for a distant estate, but they were just as likely to be deemed a shiftless vagabond, subject to arrest, corporal punishment, or forced labour. Ultimately, medieval vagrancy laws highlight a society grappling with profound transformations. They were a response to a new demographic reality, an attempt to control labour, maintain social order, and manage fear in an era of fluidity and uncertainty. These regulations were not just about policing the highways. They were about defining who belonged and who did not, drawing stark lines between us and them in a precarious search for communal safety and stability. The individual freedom of movement was heavily curtailed, revealing a state deeply invested in maintaining a static social structure, even at the cost of criminalizing those simply trying to survive. From the precarious journey of the vagrant, we turn now to the meticulously ordered world of medieval craft and trade. Imagine a city where every profession, from baker to blacksmith, from weaver to goldsmith, was meticulously governed by an intricate web of rules and regulations. These were the guild laws, often perceived today as restrictive monopolies, but in the Middle Ages, they were the bedrock of economic stability, quality control, and social welfare, governing virtually every aspect of a craftsman's life. Guilds, powerful associations of artisans and merchants, emerged in the High Middle Ages as urban centres grew. They weren't just trade unions. They were complex social, religious, and economic organizations with extensive regulatory powers. Dr. Stephen Epstein, a prominent historian of medieval economy, emphasizes that guilds aim to ensure fairness among their members, protect their craft from external competition, and uphold the quality of goods produced. Membership was often mandatory for practicing a trade within a city, creating a powerful self-governing body. The laws enforced by guilds were remarkably detailed and intrusive. They dictated everything from the hours of work and the number of apprentices a master could train, to the precise methods of production and the pricing of goods. For instance, a tailor's guild might specify the exact number of stitches per inch, or a baker's guild might outlaw night baking to prevent shoddy work under poor light. In London, the mystery of the pewterers, for example, had ordinances that rigorously controlled the quality of tin used, requiring it to be fine and without alloy of lead. This wasn't merely about protecting fellow guild members. It was a consumer protection measure decades and centuries ahead of its time. These regulations also aimed to prevent unfair competition and maintain a level playing field. Guilds often prohibited members from poaching each other's customers, advertising excessively, or stockpiling raw materials to drive up prices. The idea was to foster a cooperative environment where skilled craftsmen could earn a living, rather than a cutthroat market free for all. This was particularly vital in a period before standardized weights, measures, or widespread copyright, where reputation and trust were critical. Furthermore, guilds provided a social safety net, offering support to members in times of illness, old age, or death. They built almshouses, provided funeral benefits, and even offered loans, acting as rudimentary welfare organizations. So, while seemingly restrictive, guild laws were a sophisticated system designed to ensure economic stability, guarantee product quality, protect workers, and provide social support, all within the framework of collective responsibility and shared craft. They were the hands of steel, forging not just objects, but the very fabric of medieval urban society. The intricate web of guild regulations, far from stifling creativity, often fostered an environment where precision, pride, and the pursuit of perfection became hallmarks of medieval craftsmanship. These rules, while ensuring economic fairness and social support, were fundamentally about maintaining an exceptionally high standard of quality, a characteristic often overlooked in modern interpretations of these seemingly restrictive codes. Central to this pursuit of quality was the rigorous training system. Guilds mandated a lengthy apprenticeship, typically spanning 7 years, during which a young person would live with a master, learning every facet of the trade. This was followed by a period as a journeyman, traveling and honing skills in different workshops. Only after producing a masterpiece, a work demonstrating exceptional skill and worthy of the guild's approval, could one become a master themselves. This multi-tiered system, as detailed by historian Georges Duby, ensured that only the most skilled practitioners attained the highest ranks, safeguarding the reputation of the entire guild. This focus on quality was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was both an economic necessity and a moral imperative. In an age where mass production was non-existent, every item produced represented significant investment of time, materials, and labor. A shoddy product not only wasted resources, but could also endanger lives, whether it was a weakly constructed siege engine or faulty armor. For instance, the Goldsmiths Guild of London had strict assaying procedures to guarantee the purity of precious metals, not just for the customer, but to uphold the guild's collective honor and prevent fraud that could damage the city's commercial reputation. The rules against cheap shortcuts were relentless. Guild ordinances frequently forbade the use of inferior materials, the adulteration of products, or deceptive practices. A law from the cordwainers, shoemakers, guild in medieval Paris prohibited the mixing of new leather with old, ensuring durability and honest craftsmanship. Violations weren't just met with fines. Often, the faulty goods themselves would be publicly destroyed, sometimes in front of the offender's shop, a potent symbol of the guild's commitment to quality and a public warning. Thus, the hands of steel were guided by a collective heart of stone, unwavering in its dedication to the craft. The meticulous laws and strict enforcement of quality standards cultivated a deep sense of pride in one's work and ensured that medieval goods, from textiles to tools, were built to last. It was a system that valued skill, integrity, and durability, demonstrating that behind the seemingly bizarre regulations lay a highly rational and effective framework for economic success, consumer protection, and the enduring legacy of medieval artistry. It fostered a culture where the master's touch was indeed precise, and the pursuit of perfection was a communal endeavor. From the diligent hands of the artisan, we now turn our gaze to the medieval dining table, or rather, the laws that dictated what could and could not appear upon it. Imagine a world where the number of courses at your celebratory feast, or even the type of meat you consumed, was not a matter of personal choice or wealth, but a matter of law. These were the sumptuary laws concerning food, often dismissed as mere moralizing against gluttony, but in reality, they were a complex response to the ever-present specter of starvation and the deep-seated anxieties about social hierarchy. While we previously explored sumptuary laws related to clothing, food fell under similar, often overlapping regulations. The central theme was restraint and the visible differentiation of social classes. Dr. Paul Friedman, a scholar specializing in medieval food history, highlights that while these laws were partly moralistic, echoing the Church's condemnation of gluttony as one of the 7 deadly sins, they also served profound economic and social purposes. Firstly, these laws were an attempt to manage scarce resources. The Malthusian trap, where population growth outstrips food supply, was a constant threat throughout the Middle Ages. Crop failures, animal diseases, and warfare could quickly plunge entire regions into famine. Laws restricting excessive feasting, particularly among the wealthy, were therefore presented as a form of moral economy, encouraging prudence and discouraging conspicuous consumption when others faced hunger. For instance, a number of English sumptuary laws from the 14th century, particularly after the Black Death and subsequent economic shifts, restricted the consumption of expensive meats or the number of dishes served, often targeting the rising merchant class, whose newfound wealth allowed them to emulate aristocratic dining habits. A key aspect was the limitation on ostentatious displays of wealth. By restricting the number of courses, the types of luxury ingredients, like exotic spices or expensive game birds, or even the types of wine served, these laws aimed to prevent the blurring of social lines. The nobility feared that if commoners could mimic their lavish feasts, the inherent distinctions between the social orders would erode. This directly connects to the previous discussion of sumptuary laws on clothing, reinforcing a rigid hierarchical structure through visible markers. For example, a 1363 English statute not only dictated clothing, but specified that servants shall eat but once a day flesh or fish, and the rest lentils or other victuals easily procurable. These food-related sumptuary laws were therefore more than just pronouncements against overindulgence. They were practical attempts to conserve resources, maintain social order by reinforcing class distinctions, and project an image of responsible governance in the face of potential scarcity. The Feast of Folly, in their eyes, was not just a personal sin, but a societal danger. The enforcement of laws against gluttony and excessive feasting, while rooted in practicality, also revealed a constant tension between societal ideals and the messy reality of human behavior. Despite the moralizing and the threat of scarcity, medieval people still enjoyed communal meals, celebrations, and demonstrations of generosity. Their laws, rather than outright banning such events, often sought a precarious balance, allowing some indulgence while attempting to temper its excesses. Consider the specifics of these food sumptuary laws. They rarely imposed an outright ban on certain foods for specific classes. Instead, they restricted quantities, types of preparations, or contexts. For example, while a wealthy merchant might be forbidden from serving more than 3 courses on an ordinary day, important feasts or special occasions often received exemptions, allowing for more lavish displays. This flexibility suggests an understanding that communal feasting played a crucial role in social bonding, political alliances, and demonstrating hospitality, values as important as frugality. Moreover, the effectiveness of these laws is debated among historians. Dr. Sarah Cockrell, a scholar of medieval law, points out that enforcement was often inconsistent and selective. Petty infringements might be overlooked, while truly flagrant displays of defiance, especially by those seen as getting above their station, could be prosecuted. The very need to repeatedly issue and reissue these sumptuary laws throughout the centuries suggests they were frequently flouted. This morsel of mercy in enforcement, or perhaps simply the difficulty of policing private dining practices, indicates a complex relationship between the letter of the law and its practical application. The underlying rationale, however, remained consistent: to prevent widespread social resentment and maintain perceived fairness, especially during times of hardship. If the common folk were enduring famine, seeing their lords feast with unbridled extravagance could be a dangerous provocation, potentially leading to unrest. The laws were a public declaration that even the elite had boundaries, at least in theory, showcasing responsible governance, even if imperfectly practiced. Ultimately, these laws against gluttony were a vital cog in the machine of medieval governance. They demonstrate how deeply intertwined moral, social, and economic concerns were in shaping public policy. In a world where the very act of eating could be a matter of life and death for many, the regulation of dining was not merely about curbing indulgence. It was about managing resources, projecting social order, and ensuring the delicate balance between the ideals of Christian charity and the harsh realities of scarcity. They sought, perhaps optimistically, to balance the human desire for celebration and status with the ever-present spectre of an empty pantry and a hungry populace. From the silent strictures of the dinner table, we now shift to the spoken word, a force that, in the Middle Ages, could be as destructive as any weapon. Imagine a society where your professional standing, your marriage prospects, and even your personal safety hinged almost entirely on your reputation, a fragile construct easily shattered by a wagging tongue. This immense power of public opinion led to a fascinating set of medieval laws targeting slander and defamation, proving that even in a world predating mass media, words truly held the power of tongues of fire. In the tightly knit communities of medieval towns and villages, reputation was currency. Unlike today, where anonymity in large cities offers a degree of protection, medieval individuals lived under constant scrutiny. A person's good name was essential for business, credit, and social acceptance. To accuse someone falsely of theft, promiscuity, heresy, or even of a poor work ethic could effectively destroy their life, leading to social ostracism, economic ruin, or worse. Dr. R.H. Helmholtz, an expert in medieval English law, highlights that ecclesiastical and secular courts throughout medieval Europe dealt with an astonishing volume of defamation cases, reflecting the profound importance placed on honor and reputation. The harm caused by slander was often considered equivalent to physical injury or theft. Just as a stolen purse depleted one's material wealth, a ruined reputation stole one's social capital and future prospects. This explains the surprisingly severe penalties associated with defamation. While today defamation usually results in financial damages, in the Middle Ages, punishments could involve public shame, humiliation, or even physical discomfort. Picture a person condemned to stand in the pillory, perhaps with a sign proclaiming their offense, or being forced to ride backwards on a horse through the town while confessing their lies. Specific examples abound. In many English manorial courts and French municipal tribunals, records show cases of individuals suing for defamation of character. One common accusation was calling a woman a whore or a man a thief, which could prevent a woman from marrying well or a man from finding honest work. The courts recognized the material damage these words inflicted. For clergy, accusations of heresy or immorality were particularly devastating. These laws, therefore, were not merely about protecting feelings. They were about safeguarding the fundamental social and economic fabric of medieval life. They understood that an individual's reputation was inseparable from their ability to function within the community. In a world without widespread formal policing or welfare systems, maintaining trust and a good name was a critical form of insurance. The laws against slander were a recognition that words, though intangible, could inflict very real and lasting harm. making the regulation of speech a vital component of maintaining social order and justice. The medieval obsession with reputation and the laws designed to protect it speak volumes about the underlying social structures of the era. In a society where individual identity was intricately linked to one's family, village, and guild, a stain on one's honor could ripple outwards, impacting an entire social unit. The echo of a lie resonated far beyond the immediate target, threatening the very fabric of community cohesion and trust. Historians like Mervyn James, in his studies of honor and shame in early modern England, demonstrate that a defamation was not often a private matter. If a wife was accused of infidelity, it gravely impacted her husband's standing and the legitimacy of his children. If a merchant was called a cheat, it undermined the credibility of his entire guild. Therefore, the community had a vested interest in ensuring fair play in spoken accusations. The courts, often local and community-based, understood this dynamic acutely. Their role was not merely to ascertain truth, but to restore social harmony disrupted by injurious speech. Methods of redress were varied, reflecting a nuanced understanding of social damage. In some cases, the slanderer might be forced to make a public apology, retracting their words in the very place they were uttered, perhaps in the marketplace or outside the church after Mass. This public correction served to re-establish the defamed party's good name and simultaneously reinforce community standards against harmful gossip. For example, records from the ecclesiastical courts of Yorkshire in the 14th century show numerous instances where individuals were compelled to undergo public penance for defamation, often involving walking barefoot or making a specific declaration before the congregation. The severity of punishment often depended on the status of the defamed individual. Slandering a lord or a church official could be considered a far more serious offence, bordering on sedition or blasphemy, due to the hierarchical nature of medieval society. Blasphemy itself, a direct insult to God, was considered the ultimate slander, often punishable by death, as it threatened the spiritual welfare of the entire community. These laws against slander vividly illustrate that medieval justice understood the social consequences of words. While seemingly primitive in their application compared to modern legal systems, they recognized the profound fragility of reputation and the immense power of public perception. They were a pragmatic, albeit sometimes brutal, attempt to manage interpersonal conflict, uphold social order, and preserve the communal trust that was essential for survival in a tightly bound, interconnected world. The laws sought to ensure that while tongues might be sharp, they would not be allowed to irrevocably tear apart the fragile fabric of medieval society. From the piercing words of slander, we now turn to an equally potent but contrasting force in medieval society, the unwritten and often legally enforced codes of welcoming a stranger. Imagine a world without hotels or widespread inns, where travel was perilous and communications were slow. The sudden arrival of a stranger at your doorstep could be a source of suspicion or an opportunity for exchange. Yet, for many medieval communities, hospitality was not merely a virtue. It was often a civic duty, cemented by laws that recognized the burden of brotherhood as essential for continuity and survival. The concept of hospitality, or hospitium, was deeply ingrained in medieval European culture, driven by both Christian teachings of charity and practical necessities. Travelers, pilgrims, merchants, and even soldiers relied on the benevolence of strangers for food and lodging. Dr. Carol Rawcliffe, a historian of medieval social history, explains that while welcoming a stranger was generally seen as a moral good, the legal frameworks around it developed to manage the potential risks and responsibilities involved. While not always codified as explicit laws of hospitality in modern terms, numerous statutes and local customs imposed obligations on communities or specific individuals regarding the provision of lodging. For example, in many manorial systems, the lord of the manor had a duty to provide hospitality to important guests, and sometimes even to travelers, demonstrating his status and protecting his lands. Similarly, within towns, innkeepers gradually evolved to fulfill this role, but even private citizens could find themselves compelled. During wartime or periods of royal progress, commoners were often legally obliged to quarter soldiers or members of the royal entourage, often without significant compensation. This practice, known as purveyance, was a considerable burden, but a recognized duty. Beyond these more formal obligations, some laws aimed to prevent the dangers associated with unmanaged hospitality. For instance, bylaws in towns might regulate who could host strangers, often requiring householders to register visitors or limiting the length of their stay. This was a response to concerns about crime, espionage, or the spread of disease, as discussed in earlier chapters regarding vagrancy and public health. In some German and Italian city-states, failure to report a new arrival could result in fines, placing the burden of brotherhood within a framework of communal responsibility and surveillance. These often unwritten or locally enforced laws of hospitality reflect a profound understanding of interconnectedness in a world of limited infrastructure. They represent a compromise between the Christian ideal of welcoming the stranger and the practical need for control and security. While the stranger at the door brought with them potential risks, they also carried news, goods, and sometimes even essential services, making their reception a complex blend of religious duty, social obligation, and economic necessity. These laws, therefore, helped navigate the delicate balance between openness and self-preservation, forging communal bonds out of ancient traditions. Despite the obligations and suspicions that accompanied medieval hospitality, it also provided a crucial, albeit temporary, safety net in a world without formal welfare systems or widely accessible public support. The warm hearth offered both physical comfort and a fragile sense of security against the cold, harsh realities of the medieval landscape. These laws surrounding hospitality, therefore, reveal not just a fear of the unknown, but also a profound recognition of humanity's shared vulnerability. One of the most remarkable manifestations of this was the concept of sanctuary. Rooted in religious belief and later codified into secular law, sanctuary offered temporary protection to individuals accused of certain crimes. Fugitives could seek refuge in specific holy sites, typically churches or monasteries, for a limited period, often 40 days in England. During this time, they were safe from arrest and could negotiate for pardon, penance, or arrange to abjure the realm, that is, formally leave the country forever. Dr. Catherine Ryder, an expert in medieval history, notes that this system, while seemingly odd, provided a vital pressure valve in a justice system that could be swift and brutal, offering an alternative to immediate execution for certain offences. For example, a murder in medieval England might see the offender rush to a church and claim sanctuary, while within the consecrated ground, authorities could not touch them. This legal protection, granted by the Church, was recognized by the Crown, demonstrating a unique interplay between ecclesiastical and secular power. It wasn't an escape from justice, but a structured pause, offering an opportunity for confession, reflection, and negotiation, or simply a head start before permanent exile. However, the sanctuary was not a free pass. Those claiming it were often subject to strict conditions. They might be compelled to remain within the church grounds, were sometimes denied food or water by locals to encourage surrender, or required to make public confessions. It was a rigorous process, demonstrating that while mercy might be offered, it came with significant social and spiritual obligations. Ultimately, the laws and customs surrounding hospitality and sanctuary highlight the deep-seated desire in medieval society to mitigate the harshness of existence. While driven by fear of vagrancy and a powerful need for social control, there was also an underlying recognition of communal responsibility. Whether it was the obligation to shelter a traveller or the right to claim sanctuary, these practices offered a temporary respite, a moment of inclusion in a world quick to ostracize. They remind us that even amidst the rigid structures and severe punishments of the Middle Ages, there were mechanisms, often legally enforced, to acknowledge the fragility of human life and the enduring bonds of humanity. From the safety offered by a warm hearth or holy ground, we now delve into the brutal realities of resolving deep-seated grievances in the medieval world. Imagine a society where personal injury or insult could ignite a cycle of retributive violence, escalating from a local skirmish to a bloody conflict engulfing entire families or even villages. This was the medieval feud, and while seemingly a natural extension of a brutal age, it was also something medieval laws actively sought to curb. Laws against private feuds, though often imperfectly enforced, reveal an evolving understanding of centralized justice and a desperate attempt to channel the powerful thirst for vengeance into more controlled, less destructive avenues. At the heart of the medieval legal system lay the concept of blood feud, or fida. Before the establishment of strong central governments, vengeance was often a family affair, a perceived duty to avenge wrongs against one's kin. Dr. Stephen D. White, a historian specializing in medieval legal culture, describes how a personal injury, a theft, or especially a murder, could trigger a chain reaction of violence that might span generations. This wasn't merely lawlessness. It was a deeply ingrained social custom, often seen as a legitimate form of justice in the absence of effective state intervention. However, monarchies and nascent state powers recognized that unchecked private warfare was profoundly destabilizing. It crippled trade, depopulated lands, and constantly challenged the authority of the crown. The king's peace was a fragile concept, constantly undermined by local disputes. This led to persistent efforts to prohibit, or at least regulate feuds. One of the earliest and most widespread strategies was the Truce of God and Peace of God movements, initiated by the Church in the 10th and 11th centuries. While not strictly state laws, these ecclesiastical decrees sought to limit fighting to certain days of the week or periods of the year, e.g., Lent, Advent, and protect non-combatants like clergy, peasants, and merchants. These were early attempts to impose order. As royal power grew, kings increasingly asserted their right to be the sole arbiter of justice. Laws were passed making private warfare illegal, gradually replacing it with royal courts and defined punishments. For instance, in England, the evolution from bot, compensation for injury, and vergild, compensation for death, paid to the victim's family, to fines paid to the crown, reflected this shift. By the 13th century, acts of private vengeance were increasingly viewed as crimes against the king, not just against the injured party. These laws, therefore, represent a crucial step in the development of modern legal systems. They were not just attempts to prevent violence, they were foundational to establishing the state's monopoly on legitimate force and justice. The wager of war was slowly but surely supplanted by the more controlled mechanisms of law, demonstrating a growing recognition that communal peace and the strength of the realm depended on curbing the individual's right to vengeance. They were, in essence, an effort to replace the cycle of blood with the rule of law. The transition from widespread private feuds to a more centralized system of justice was a slow, arduous process, marked by centuries of conflict between traditional customs and the emerging power of the state. The blood on the cobbles was a stark reminder of the costs of unchecked vengeance, prompting medieval rulers to devise increasingly sophisticated and often brutal legal mechanisms to enforce the king's peace. One critical element in this shift was the development of formalized procedures for conflict resolution. Instead of direct retaliation, parties were encouraged and eventually compelled to bring their grievances before a court. These courts, whether royal, manorial, or ecclesiastical, offered a public forum for accusations and defenses, aiming to provide an impartial verdict. While far from perfect, these mechanisms offered an alternative to cycles of bloodshed, allowing for arguments and evidence to replace blades and arrows. The penalties for engaging in private warfare or for refusing to accept a court's judgment were severe, reflecting the paramount importance placed on upholding the royal monopoly on violence. Those who persisted in feuding could face confiscation of property, exile, or even execution for treason against the crown. The Assizes of Clarendon, 1166, and Northampton, 1176, under Henry II in England, for instance, dramatically strengthened royal justice by establishing a system of royal justices, grand juries, and standard procedures for criminal cases, significantly curtailing the scope for private vengeance. Furthermore, the legal system developed ways to encourage reconciliation, particularly in cases of lesser offences or accidental harm. Compensation, known as vergild for homicide or bot for injury, was a long-standing Germanic custom where the offender or their family would pay a negotiated sum to the victim's family. While eventually superseded by fines to the crown, these forms of financial atonement aimed to prevent further bloodshed by monetizing vengeance. This was not about forgiveness in the modern sense, but about restoring a balance and preventing an escalation of violence. Ultimately, the laws against private feuds represent one of the most significant legal transformations of the Middle Ages. They underscore a profound understanding that societal stability, economic prosperity, and the very authority of the state depended on its ability to control violence and administer justice. While the methods were often crude and at times barbaric, the underlying rationale was a sophisticated quest for peace and order, replacing the ancient rhythms of retribution with the burgeoning, yet imperfect, rule of law. The desire to prevent blood on the cobbles paved the way for the development of the modern state and its role as the ultimate arbiter of justice. From the heavy hand of justice regulating private feuds, we return to a more subtle, yet equally powerful form of social control, the silent language of clothing. Imagine a bustling medieval market, where, at a glance, you could discern a person's social rank, profession, and even their moral standing, simply by the cut of their tunic, the hue of their cloak, or the fabric of their hose. This instant social mapping was not accidental. It was painstakingly constructed and enforced through extensive dress codes and sumptuary laws that dictated every weaver's thread in a deliberate effort to preserve social order and identity. We touched upon sumptuary laws briefly when discussing food consumption, but their application to clothing was even more pervasive and explicitly defined. Dr. Sarah J. Wasim, a specialist in medieval material culture, highlights that in an age of limited literacy, visual cues were paramount for communicating status and identity. Who you were meant what you could wear, creating a clear, unmistakable sartorial hierarchy. These laws weren't merely fashion advice. They were legally binding statutes designed to prevent the blurring of class lines that authorities feared could lead to social instability. The reasons for these regulations were multifaceted. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, they reinforced social stratification. After the Black Death, a period of immense social upheaval, rising wages for commoners meant that some could afford more luxurious fabrics and styles, mimicking the nobility. This challenged the established feudal order. The English Sumptuary Law of 1363 is a prime example, meticulously detailing allowed fabrics and colours for each social estate, from princes to peasants. Common labourers were restricted to coarse cloths, while knights and nobles could adorn themselves with silk, furs, and imported fabrics like scarlet wool. Fur, in particular, was a highly regulated luxury, with ermine and sable reserved for the uppermost echelons. Beyond social control, economic considerations also played a role. These laws aimed to curb excessive spending, particularly on imported luxury goods, which could drain national wealth and demonstrate vanity, a sin condemned by the Church. As historian Philippe Erlanger notes, the burgeoning merchant class, often wealthier than impoverished nobility, was a particular target, as their display of wealth through clothing threatened to destabilize traditional power dynamics. Finally, dress codes sometimes carried moral or religious implications. Specific colors or cuts might be associated with certain professions or even marginalized groups, further defining their place in society. For instance, in some parts of medieval Europe, Jews were compelled to wear distinctive badges or hats by law, a visible mark of their segregation. These dress codes, therefore, were far more than superficial dictates about fashion. They were an integral tool for maintaining social cohesion, economic stability, and hierarchical order in a complex and often turbulent society. Every stitch, every dye, every choice of material contributed to a silent yet powerful language of status, ensuring that everyone knew their place within the grand tapestry of the medieval world. The persistent challenge authorities faced in enforcing dress codes highlights a fascinating human truth. Despite legal decrees, the desire for personal expression and social aspiration often transcended the rigid boundaries imposed by law. These laws weren't just about what people wore. They became a battleground for identity, a visible manifestation of societal tension between traditional order and individual ambition. The very need to repeatedly enact and reinforce sumptuary laws points to their inherent difficulty in enforcement. Dr. Diane Owen Hughes, a specialist in medieval Italian social history, demonstrates that throughout Europe, chroniclers and officials frequently lamented the outrageous array and how people of low estate continued to dress above their station. This persistent flaunting occurred despite fines and public shaming, suggesting that the perceived benefits of visually asserting higher status outweighed the risks for many. People invested heavily in clothing, not merely for warmth, but as a crucial tool for social advancement, particularly in burgeoning urban centers, where traditional feudal bonds were weakening. Consider the role of guild halls and urban councils. While they actively enforce sumptuary laws to maintain order, their records also reveal a nuanced reality. A wealthy merchant, despite being technically forbidden from wearing certain furs, might subtly incorporate them into cloaks, daring local officials to challenge his economic power. Craftspeople, whose skills brought wealth, could subtly push boundaries, as seen in the increasing elaborateness of civic and guild uniforms. These weren't just humble outfits. They often incorporated colors and fabrics traditionally reserved for higher ranks, providing a permissible outlet for display. Moreover, the laws themselves sometimes built in exemptions for specific events or individuals. Knights, for example, could wear more elaborate attire when participating in tournaments or accompanying their lords, underscoring the performative aspect of medieval identity. Servants, when performing duties for their lords, might wear livery that reflected their master's status, not their own. This dynamic reflected the understanding that while individual ambition needed curbing, ceremonial display and the hierarchy of service were still important. Ultimately, sumptuary laws, though seemingly bizarre, were a direct reflection of a society grappling with rapid social and economic change. They were an attempt to freeze a dynamic reality, to maintain a visual order that was increasingly being challenged by new wealth and shifting power structures. The weight of expectations to conform battled constantly with the human drive to aspire and to express identity, revealing a persistent tension at the heart of medieval urban life. These laws, therefore, provide a unique window into the social psychology of the Middle Ages, demonstrating that even back then, people understood the power of a well-chosen garment to speak volumes about who they were and who they aspired to be. From the visible markers of social status, we now turn to the unseen, whispered threats that haunted medieval monarchs, the dark machinations of conspiracy. Imagine a world where alliances were fluid, power was hereditary but often contested, and a single rumor could spark a rebellion. In such an environment, the threat of hidden plots against the crown was omnipresent, prompting rulers to encode laws against conspiracy and treason with brutal clarity. These laws, while seemingly draconian, reveal a deep understanding of the fragility of power and the meticulous efforts required to secure the crown against any whisper of treason. The medieval definition of treason was expansive, reflecting the highly personalized nature of kingship. An act against the monarch was an act against the state, often considered a crime against God himself. Early laws, like the 1352 Treason Act in England, attempted to codify what constituted treason, including imagining the king's death, waging war against him, or counterfeiting his coin. However, the concept of conspiracy to commit treason went further, criminalizing intent and secret plotting before any overt act occurred. Dr. Elizabeth Papp Kamali, a historian of medieval English law, emphasizes that preventing rebellion before it materialized was a constant preoccupation for rulers lacking modern intelligence-gathering capabilities. The reasons for such harshness were existential. A successful conspiracy could depose a king, destabilize an entire kingdom, and plunge it into civil war, bringing widespread death and destruction. Monarchs often ruled through a delicate balance of alliances, feudal obligations, and sheer force of personality. Any challenge to this intricate web had to be crushed swiftly and unequivocally. The severity of punishments for treason, often hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, and burning for women, was not just about vengeance. It was a public spectacle designed to terrorize potential plotters and reaffirm the absolute authority of the crown. Cases of alleged conspiracy are rife in medieval chronicles. Consider the various plots against Henry IV of England, a usurper who constantly feared rivals to the throne. His paranoia led to numerous swift and brutal executions of those merely suspected of plotting against him, whether real or imagined. The eye of the crown was always watching, and fear was a primary tool of governance. Informers, sometimes rewarded, sometimes threatened, played a crucial role in uncovering these clandestine threats. These laws, therefore, were less about justice for an individual crime and more about state security and the preservation of a fragile political order. They demonstrate a pragmatic, if ruthless, recognition that power, once attained, required constant vigilance and extreme measures to sustain. In a world where loyalty was a scarce commodity and usurpation a constant possibility, laws against conspiracy were the monarch's ultimate defense, ensuring that any challenges to the crown were met with overwhelming force, even if based on a mere whisper. They were the legal bulwarks against chaos and the instruments for cementing nascent nation-states. The pervasive fear of conspiracy and the laws enacted to combat it cast long shadows of doubt across the medieval political landscape. In an era where feudal loyalties were complex and often conditional, the definition of treason could be highly subjective, shifting with the political winds. This made the accused vulnerable to the heavy hand of power, highlighting the inherent tension between a monarch's need for stability and the potential for injustice. The very concept of a fair trial, as we understand it today, was often absent in cases of alleged treason or conspiracy. Accusations, particularly from figures close to the crown, could be enough to trigger immediate arrest and torture to extract confessions. Professor J.G. Bellamy, a leading authority on treason law, emphasizes that proof in such cases was often circumstantial, based more on suspicion and the perceived threat to royal authority than on concrete evidence. Legal procedures, such as trial by combat or ordeal, while waning, were sometimes still invoked, further demonstrating the lack of objective standards. Consider the case of Thomas of Lancaster, a powerful English magnate executed for treason in 1322. His trial was a hurried affair, conducted by his sworn enemies, and without the chance to speak in his own defence. His treason was his persistent opposition to King Edward II's rule, culminating in armed rebellion. While clearly an act against the monarch, the swift and summary execution served less as impartial justice and more as a powerful demonstration of royal retribution against a perceived threat. The reach of these laws extended beyond direct plotting. Even knowledge of a conspiracy, without reporting it, could implicate an individual. This created an atmosphere of suspicion, where trust was a dangerous commodity. Vassals were bound by oaths of fealty, but these oaths could be tested in times of civil strife. For example, during the Wars of the Roses in England, shifting allegiances meant that individuals who backed the losing side were frequently condemned as traitors, their lands confiscated, and families ruined. These laws, therefore, reveal a desperate and often brutal practicality. Monarchs, constantly striving to consolidate and maintain power, recognized that internal dissent, left unchecked, could prove far more dangerous than external enemies. While the justice meted out might seem arbitrary or cruel by modern standards, it was a calculated strategy to ensure loyalty, suppress opposition, and secure the crown's position. In a world where political survival was paramount, the heavy hand of power descended swiftly and mercilessly upon anyone suspected of betrayal, acting as a chilling deterrent against the shadows of doubt. These laws stand as a stark reminder of the immense human cost incurred in the forging of the state's supreme authority. From the grand conspiracies that threaten thrones, we now turn to a more prosaic, yet equally regulated aspect of medieval life: the ownership and management of animals. Imagine a medieval village where your pig's wanderings could incur a fine, or your dog's barking could spark a legal dispute. Animals in the Middle Ages were not merely pets or livestock. They were central to survival, work, and community well-being, leading to a complex web of laws governing their presence and behavior that reflect the daily beast's burden on the lives of medieval people. In modern society, we rarely consider the legal implications of animal ownership beyond licensing or leash laws. But in the crowded, often unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages, domesticated animals were constant variables. Dr. Susan Crane, a historian specializing in medieval English culture, highlights that animals were deeply integrated into human spaces, leading to frequent conflicts and the necessity for detailed regulations. These laws, while sometimes appearing trivial, were crucial for public order, health, and economic stability. One pervasive type of animal law concerned free-roaming livestock. Pigs, in particular, were notorious for scavenging through streets and gardens. While they provided a vital food source, their unchecked wandering could damage crops, spread disease, and create immense filth. Therefore, many towns and manors instituted bylaws requiring pigs to be ringed. A metal ring through the nose prevented them from rooting, or kept in sties. Unsupervised pigs found foraging in public spaces often resulted in fines for their owners, as records from Southampton and York attest. In some areas, free-roaming cattle or horses could also be impounded, with penalties for retrieval. Dogs, too, were subject to specific regulations. While hunting dogs were highly valued companions for the nobility, and working dogs aided shepherds, less useful curs were often seen as a nuisance. Laws might limit the number of dogs a household could keep, prohibit them from barking excessively at night, a violation of the curfew in some areas, or require them to be lawed, their forepaws mutilated to prevent them from chasing game on noble lands, a clear protection of hunting rights. The economic significance of animal laws cannot be overstated. Livestock represented valuable capital, and their protection from theft or disease was paramount. Disputes over ownership, stray animals, or damage caused by animals were frequent occurrences in local courts. These seemingly bizarre laws often carried surprisingly good reasons, reflecting a pragmatic attempt to manage the close cohabitation of humans and animals. They protected property, ensured public health, and minimized friction in communities where the daily grind was heavily reliant on the beast burden and its careful management. The intimate relationship between medieval humans and their animals extended far beyond mere ownership. It involved a complex tapestry of interdependence, where animals provided sustenance, labor, and companionship, often at great personal cost. Laws governing these interactions reflect not only a pragmatic concern for order, but also a hidden dimension of medieval morality and an evolving understanding of shared existence, binding hooves and humanity in a common struggle. Perhaps one of the most remarkable, and today bizarre aspects of medieval animal law was the phenomenon of animal trials. Imagine a pig being formally charged in a court of law, represented by a lawyer, and potentially executed for the murder of a child. This was a documented reality across medieval Europe, particularly in France and Switzerland, with records stretching from the 13th to the 18th centuries. Dr. E.P. Evans, in his seminal work The Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, chronicles hundreds of such cases. While seemingly absurd, these trials served several crucial purposes. Firstly, they satisfied a deep-seated demand for justice. When a domestic animal caused death or serious injury, especially to a child, the community needed an explanation and an expiation of the transgression. These trials provided a public ritual, a catharsis for collective grief and outrage, allowing the community to reassert order in the face of chaos. The animal might be executed in front of the community, serving as a powerful, albeit misguided deterrent to other animals, and a reassurance that justice, however strange, had been done. Secondly, these trials often had theological underpinnings. Animals that caused harm were sometimes viewed as agents of the devil, or as having been corrupted by evil, making their punishment a spiritual cleansing. Concurrently, the process provided a legal framework for restitution. If the animal was deemed responsible, its owner might be required to pay compensation to the victim's family, reflecting the animal's economic value and the human cost of its actions. Beyond these dramatic trials, everyday animal laws aim to protect animals not merely as property, but as vital assets contributing to the shared struggle. Cruelty to animals, particularly working animals, could be frowned upon or even penalized, not out of modern welfare concerns, but because an injured or overworked animal was an economic loss to the community. Laws often regulated the loading of beasts of burden, the conditions under which animals were moved, and even the humane slaughter of livestock, demonstrating a practical concern for their utility. These laws, therefore, represent a unique window into the medieval worldview. They reveal a society that, while appearing harsh and unsophisticated by modern standards, possessed an intricate legal and social structure that addressed the myriad challenges of daily life. From the protection of crops to the punishment of a murderous pig, these regulations highlight a constant effort to manage the delicate balance of an ecosystem where humans and animals were inextricably linked, bound by mutual dependence, shared struggles, and a legal system striving to make sense of and impose order upon their common existence. From the complex social dynamics of animal trials, we circle back to a foundational yet perennial challenge of medieval urban life, the pervasive and deadly threat of disease. Imagine a city where the common wisdom attributed illness to noxious odors or miasmas, rising from the filth that choked its streets and waterways. While their understanding of germ theory was centuries away, this intuitive connection between the scent of sickness and outbreaks of plague led to a renewed and often drastic implementation of sanitation laws, revealing a society wrestling with an invisible, silent assassin. We previously explored early laws against filth, but the devastating impact of the Black Death in the mid-14th century and subsequent recurrent outbreaks of plague dramatically intensified official and public concern about urban hygiene. While medieval authorities did not understand bacteria or viruses, they observed patterns. Disease thrived in unsanitary conditions. Dr. Carol Rawcliffe, a leading authority on medieval health and disease, emphasizes that an intuitive grasp of environmental determinants of health began to inform stricter urban legislation. Following major plague events, cities across Europe enacted far-reaching ordinances. Venice, a major trading hub, was a pioneer, establishing the first permanent plague control board in 1348. Its regulations included isolating sick individuals, burning their possessions, and crucially, enforcing rigorous cleaning of public spaces. In Florence, after its devastating 1348 plague experience, laws mandated the removal of refuse, the cleaning of latrines, and even regulated the disposal of raw blood and offal from butchers, not merely for convenience but for the health of the citizens. These laws were often specific and intrusive. Householders could be fined for dumping waste into the streets, for not cleaning gutters, or for having overflowing cesspits. Markets, particularly for meat and fish, were placed under stricter scrutiny, with dedicated officials, often called scavengers or rakers, employed to ensure cleanliness and proper waste disposal. While these roles existed before the plague, the post-plague era saw their powers and responsibilities significantly augmented. The penalties for violating these sanitation laws could be surprisingly harsh, reflecting the heightened fear of disease. Fines were common, but repeat offenders could face public humiliation in the stocks, or even imprisonment. The logic was clear. Individual negligence in sanitation was seen as a threat to the entire community's health, and therefore a communal responsibility. The whispers of plague served as a stark reminder that collective survival depended on a concerted effort to combat the visible manifestations of disease, even if the true microscopic agents remained hidden. These laws, therefore, were a desperate yet rational response to an invisible enemy, paving the way for nascent public health policy. The stringent sanitation laws that emerged in the wake of recurring plagues were not simply a matter of hygiene. They were intertwined with the broader medieval worldview, reflecting a profound interplay between physical well-being, spiritual devotion, and civic responsibility. In an age where the cause of disease remained a mystery, the act of cleansing the soul and street became a desperate, holistic fight for life. While the scientific understanding of disease transmission was absent, a sense of moral purity was often linked to physical cleanliness. Many medieval chroniclers and religious texts suggested that plague and other epidemics were divine punishments for sin. Therefore, efforts at urban sanitation, while based on empirical observation of what seemed to reduce disease, were also framed within a religious context. Good hygiene could be seen as an act of devotion, a way to appease an angry God, and a collective effort to demonstrate a community's moral worthiness to survive. Cities like Venice and Milan, frequently hit by epidemics, began to implement even more sophisticated, albeit still rudimentary, public health measures. Beyond just cleaning streets, they initiated public health boards and employed officials, not merely to clean, but to survey for disease, enforce quarantines, and manage medical responses. Dr. Carlo M. Tipola, a renowned economic historian, meticulously documented the public health policies of Italian city-states, showcasing how, from the 15th century onwards, these cities developed sophisticated systems for medical surveillance, waste removal, and even building regulations to improve ventilation, all directly influenced by the recurring threat of plague. Quarantine itself, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days, was a direct legal response born from this era. Ships arriving from infected ports were legally mandated to anchor offshore for 40 days before passengers and cargo could disembark. This pioneering public health law, first formally established in Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, in 1377, and later adopted by Venice and other Mediterranean ports, recognized the principle of incubation, even if the underlying biological mechanism was unknown. The scale of this effort required dedication from all levels of society. Citizens were compelled to take part in cleaning initiatives, to report the sick, and to adhere to these new, often inconvenient regulations. Failure to comply could mean public shaming, fines, or even more severe penalties, highlighting the supreme importance placed on collective survival. These laws, shaped by desperation and driven by a strong sense of civic and spiritual devotion, represent a critical turning point in the history of public health. They were not merely eccentric relics of a bygone era. They formed the nascent blueprint for modern sanitation and disease control. They demonstrate an extraordinary resilience and a pragmatic approach to governance, where communities struggled to assert control over the unseen forces that threatened their very existence, constantly innovating to purify both their physical environment and their collective soul in the ceaseless fight for life. From the dramatic public health measures to combat invisible contagions, we now shift our focus to the intimate yet heavily regulated realm of personal relationships. Imagine a society where the joining of two individuals in matrimony was not simply a matter of love or personal choice, but a complex legal and social contract meticulously woven into the loom of life itself. Laws regulating marriage in the Middle Ages, while appearing restrictive today, were fundamental to maintaining social order, economic stability, and the inheritance of property, reflecting a profound understanding of marriage as the bedrock of medieval society. In medieval Europe, marriage was a tripartite institution, involving theological, ecclesiastical, and secular legal components. While the Church defined marriage as a sacrament, indissoluble, and initiated by free consent, secular authorities had a vested interest in regulating it for the sake of property, lineage, and alliance. Dr. Judith M. Bennett, a leading scholar of medieval women's history, highlights that marriage was rarely a purely romantic venture. It was a pragmatic tool for consolidating wealth, forging political connections, and ensuring the continuity of families and estates. One of the most notable and often surprising aspects of medieval marriage law was the relatively low age of consent for girls, often as young as 12, and 14 for boys, as established by canon law. While this seems shocking by modern standards, it was predicated on the understanding that marriage was an adult status, conferring responsibilities rather than waiting for emotional maturity. Early betrothal and marriage practices were also influenced by high child mortality rates, encouraging early unions to ensure progeny. However, despite the Church advocating for consent as the primary ingredient for a valid marriage, parental and feudal lords' permission was usually essential for marriages among the nobility and landed gentry. This was not merely social pressure. It was legally enforced, particularly when significant land or titles were at stake. A lord had legal rights to approve or disapprove the marriage of his vassals, especially female wards, as their unions could shift property and allegiances. For example, a noblewoman could not marry without the approval of her feudal lord, as her marriage could affect the military service owed to him. These laws, therefore, were less about individual happiness and more about the collective good of the community and the preservation of entrenched social structures. They dictated who could marry whom, when, and under what conditions, acting as a crucial mechanism for transmitting property and power from one generation to the next. The regulation of marriage was central to maintaining the fabric of society, ensuring that the bonds of society were tied not just by affection, but by law, necessity, and the intricate threads of inheritance and alliance. Despite the emphasis on duty and pragmatism in medieval marriage laws, the human elements of desire and the enduring hope for posterity were never entirely absent, though often subsumed under broader social and economic imperatives. The legal framework, while seemingly rigid, also provided avenues for personal agency and adaptation, reflecting the complex interplay between individual will and communal expectations. One significant area of legal intervention was the prohibition of consanguinity, or marriage between close relatives. The Church, through canon law, had an extensive and intricate system of prohibitions, often extending to 7 degrees of kinship. While this was partly based on biblical injunctions and a perceived risk of spiritual incest, historians like Christopher Brooke also point out the practical effects. By forcing individuals to seek spouses outside their immediate familial and local networks, these laws help to prevent the concentration of wealth and power within too few hands, encouraging broader social and political alliances. Dispensations could be obtained, usually for a fee and with papal approval, allowing exceptions for politically or economically strategic unions, demonstrating the Church's pragmatic flexibility. Bigamy, of course, was strictly forbidden, not only for moral reasons, but also for practical legal ones concerning inheritance and legitimacy. A person could only have one spouse at a time, and the validity of a marriage was crucial for determining the rightful heirs to property and titles. This legal clarity was vital for the stability of land ownership, the economic backbone of medieval society. While arranged marriages were common, especially among the elite, the Church's insistence on free consent for a valid marriage also provided a surprising degree of agency. A couple who exchanged vows de praesenti, in the present tense, even without witnesses, were considered legally married under canon law, despite parents' objections. This led to instances of clandestine marriages, which, while often frowned upon, were legally binding, creating tension between ecclesiastical and secular authorities keen on parental control. This demonstrates that individual desire, though challenging the social order, often found legal, albeit often difficult, pathways. Ultimately, the laws regulating marriage in the Middle Ages were a masterful blend of spiritual doctrine, economic necessity, and social engineering. While they may appear to us as overly controlling, they articulated a clear societal understanding of marriage not as a private affair, but as a foundational institution that underpinned the transmission of property, the forging of alliances, and the very continuity of the family and community. These regulations, therefore, were less about stifling human emotion and more about harnessing the powerful forces of love and desire to serve the greater good of a society striving perpetually for stability, order, and the enduring hope of generations to come. From the intimate bonds of marriage, we now shift to the intellectual sphere, exploring the laws that shaped medieval education and the very dissemination of knowledge. Imagine a time when literacy was a rare privilege, and the pursuit of learning was not a universal right, but a carefully controlled process, guided by specific laws and decrees. These regulations, often found within ecclesiastical or university charters, reveal a society deeply invested in the strategic management of education, viewing the scholar's scroll not just as a tool for personal enlightenment, but as a powerful instrument for shaping society and preserving established truths. Medieval education was predominantly a church-led enterprise. Monasteries, cathedrals, and later universities were the primary centers of learning. The laws governing these institutions were therefore largely ecclesiastical. Dr. Hastings Rashdall, whose voluminous work on the universities of Europe in the Middle Ages remains foundational, illustrates that the earliest universities, like Bologna and Paris, emerged organically from groups of scholars and students, but quickly sought papal and royal charters to gain legal recognition, protection, and autonomy. These charters established their privileges, such as exemption from certain secular laws, but also imposed regulations on their curriculum, conduct, and the qualifications of their masters. One crucial law, established by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, mandated that every cathedral church should have a master appointed to teach grammar free of charge to poor scholars. This was a significant step, signaling a recognition that access to basic education, particularly for future clergy, was a societal good. While not universal primary education, it ensured a baseline level of literacy and theological understanding within the church hierarchy. The curriculum itself was heavily regulated, particularly in universities. The liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, formed the foundation, taught via fixed texts and prescribed commentaries. Theology, law, canon and Roman, and medicine were the higher faculties. This standardized curriculum, mandated by university statutes, ensured a common intellectual framework and adherence to orthodox thought. For instance, in Paris, the Faculty of Theology jealously guarded its curriculum against new or controversial ideas, banning certain Aristotelian texts at various points for their perceived threat to Christian doctrine. These laws governing education were not designed to encourage free inquiry in the modern sense. Instead, they aimed to produce trained professionals for the church and state, uphold established religious doctrines, and maintain social order. The quest for knowledge was therefore a guided journey, carefully managed to reinforce existing power structures. The scholar's scroll represented not just the accumulation of learning, but the disciplined transmission of approved wisdom, ensuring intellectual continuity and stability in a constantly challenging world. Within the meticulously structured world of medieval education, the interplay between individual curiosity and institutional control was a constant dynamic. While laws dictated curriculum and orthodoxy, the very pursuit of knowledge, the act of putting ink and illumination to parchment, represented an inextinguishable light in the darkness, constantly challenging the boundaries of received wisdom and pushing the frontiers of understanding. The proliferation of universities itself, particularly from the 12th century onwards, created new intellectual spaces where debate and inquiry, while regulated, were also highly valued. University statutes often included provisions for disputations and debates, formal academic exercises where students and masters would argue opposing points of view on various topics. While these were ultimately meant to reinforce orthodoxy, they also fostered critical thinking and rhetorical skill, allowing for subtle challenges to established interpretations. Dr. Walter Rueg's comprehensive History of the University in Europe stresses the innovative role of these institutions in developing systematic methods of inquiry. However, the Church maintained a vigilant oversight. Heresy, the deviation from accepted religious doctrine, was considered an existential threat. Laws against heresy often targeted scholarly writings deemed subversive. For instance, the works of figures like John Wycliffe in England or Jan Hus in Bohemia, who challenged papal authority and certain church doctrines, were condemned, their followers persecuted, and their writings burned. These actions, while suppressing dissent, ironically led to the development of sophisticated theological arguments in defense of orthodoxy, stimulating further intellectual activity within prescribed bounds. Beyond texts, The very act of studying was often governed by specific regulations. University scholars, particularly in arts faculties, were typically unmarried clerics, subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Their behavior, attire, and even their leisure activities were often regulated through university statutes. For example, laws in many universities explicitly forbade gambling, excessive drinking, or brawling among students, reflecting a desire to maintain the moral and intellectual integrity of the academic community. Punishments could range from fines and public penance to expulsion. Ultimately, the laws concerning medieval education, from curriculum control to the suppression of heresy, were a testament to the power knowledge held. They demonstrate a society that recognized the transformative potential of learning and sought to harness it, not for radical change, but for the maintenance and improvement of the existing order. Despite the heavy hand of control, the intellectual ferment within these educational institutions ensured that the light of inquiry, however flickering, continued to illuminate the medieval world, shaping minds and laying foundational concepts that would eventually blossom into later intellectual revolutions. The quest for knowledge, even under strictures, was an enduring human drive, making the ink and illumination a powerful force, even in the darkness of the medieval era. From the abstract knowledge preserved within the scholar's scroll, we now turn to the tangible world of medieval architecture. Imagine standing in a bustling medieval town, a kaleidoscope of timber-framed houses, stone churches, and towering city walls. Every brick laid, every beam raised, was not merely a matter of engineering. It was governed by a complex set of laws and customs that shaped the very landscape of human settlement. These were the laws on construction, and while seemingly mundane, they reveal a profound appreciation for civic order, public safety, and the enduring structure of power embodied in the builder's stone. Medieval construction laws emerged primarily from practical necessities and a desire for communal welfare. With burgeoning urban populations and limited space, regulating building was crucial to prevent accidents, fires, and disputes. Dr. Derek Keane, a leading historian of medieval London, notes that city ordinances frequently dictated aspects like minimum street widths, the projection of upper stories, jettying, and the materials used for roofing, demonstrating an early form of urban planning and building codes. Foremost among concerns was fire prevention. As discussed with curfews, medieval towns were highly susceptible to devastating conflagrations. The use of highly flammable materials like thatch for roofing was gradually outlawed in many cities, replaced by more fire-resistant tiles or slate. In London, particularly after devastating fires in the 12th and 13th centuries, ordinances increasingly prohibited thatch roofs and mandated that party walls between properties be built of stone, a costly but vital measure to create fire breaks. These laws, though burdensome for individual homeowners, were a collective investment in urban survival. Beyond fire safety, construction laws also addressed issues of public thoroughfare and neighborhood amenity. Laws might prohibit building encroachments onto public streets, dictate the placement of drains, or regulate the height of structures to ensure light and air access. The famous law of the wall in many continental European cities, for example, granted the owner of an existing wall the right to prevent new construction from compromising its structural integrity. This served both to protect private property and to maintain a degree of urban order. Furthermore, building embodied power. The construction of a castle, a cathedral, or a city wall was a visible manifestation of authority, wealth, and communal identity. Laws dictating the right to build fortified structures, licensed to crenellate, were jealously guarded by the crown, ensuring that only trusted nobles could erect such symbols of independent power. Even the size and grandeur of private dwellings were sometimes subject to sumptuary-like regulations designed to maintain social stratification and prevent excessive display among the nouveau riche. These laws, therefore, were far more than simple blueprints. They were socio-economic and political statements, aiming to impose order, ensure safety, and reinforce hierarchical structures through the very physical fabric of medieval communities. Every builder's stone contributed not only to practical shelter, but to the enduring structure of power and the collective identity of the urban landscape. Beyond the immediate concerns of fire safety and public order, medieval construction laws were deeply intertwined with the economic and social fabric that allowed communities to thrive. They were the foundations of fortune, defining the intricate relationship between craft, community, and the collective desire to forge an enduring legacy in stone and timber. The regulation of building practices was often managed by powerful craft guilds, particularly the masons' guilds. These guilds, as we explored before, established meticulous standards for workmanship, materials, and professional conduct. Their ordinances weren't just about limiting competition. They were about safeguarding the reputation of the craft and ensuring the longevity of structures. Dr. John H. Harvey, a prominent historian of medieval architecture, emphasizes that the quality of medieval construction, especially of great churches and castles, is a testament to these stringent guild controls. A faulty building was not only a danger, but a public disgrace for the master mason and his guild. Laws also dictated resource management and urban development. With limited local resources, particularly timber and stone, regulations might control logging, quarrying, or the import of materials. As urban populations grew, the pressure for expansion was immense. Laws governing property lines, shared walls, and rights of way were frequent subjects of dispute in local courts, leading to complex legal precedents that aimed to balance individual property rights with communal good. For example, many towns had regulations about eaves and gutters to ensure rainwater from one property didn't damage a neighbor's. The very act of building was a public affair, involving neighbors, guilds, and civic authorities. The communal labor often involved in raising large structures, from cathedrals to city walls, fostered a strong sense of civic pride and shared identity. Laws often mandated citizen contributions to such projects, either through labor or taxation, highlighting the understanding that shared infrastructure was a collective responsibility. This sense of shared ownership further reinforced the importance of the construction laws that ensured quality and longevity. These construction laws were not merely a means of maintaining order. They were integral to the creation of robust, functional, and enduring urban environments. They fostered a culture of craftsmanship, disciplined resource use, and collective investment that allowed medieval towns to grow, adapt, and build the physical legacy that we still admire today. The foundations of fortune were literally laid in the ground, bound by regulations that ensured every stone spoke of community, skill, and the enduring human desire to leave an indelible mark on the landscape. These laws transformed simple building materials into testaments of human endeavor and the organized, strategic creation of a lasting world. From the enduring structures of stone, we now move to the invisible, yet profoundly powerful structures of belief. Imagine a society where every aspect of life, from mundane daily routines to grand political gestures, was permeated by an unwavering faith in a divine order. In such a world, an attack on that faith was not merely an abstract philosophical disagreement. It was an act of profound subversion, a cosmic insult that threatened the very fabric of existence. This deep devotion led to specific laws against blasphemy and heresy, reflecting the medieval world's profound fear of the divine and a fervent desire to protect the community from the whispers of heresy. In medieval Europe, the state and the church were inextricably linked. God's favor was believed to be essential for a kingdom's prosperity, a monarch's legitimate rule, and the prevention of natural disasters or epidemics. To defy God or corrupt Christian doctrine was, therefore, an act of treason against both spiritual and temporal authorities. Dr. Malcolm Lambert, a leading historian of medieval heresy, underscores that heresy was seen as a contagious disease of the soul, more dangerous than physical plague because it jeopardized eternal salvation for individuals and divine protection for the community. The laws against blasphemy, the irreverent utterance against God or sacred things, were designed as a first line of defense. While often punished by public shaming, fines, or corporal punishment, e.g., whipping, ear cropping, its severity depended on the context and perceived intent. A casual curse might warrant a lesser penalty than a deliberate public denouncement of Christ. In some Spanish kingdoms during the Reconquista, blasphemy laws were particularly severe, reflecting the heightened religious tensions of the era. Heresy, however, was a far graver offense, often met with the harshest possible penalty, death by burning. This was not a punishment invented by the Church. It was a Roman imperial penalty for certain crimes, adopted for heresy because fire was seen as ritually cleansing, and because burning ensured complete destruction of the body, believed to prevent resurrection. The ad abolendum bull of Pope Lucius III in 1184, and later the establishment of the Papal Inquisition in the 13th century, institutionalized the detection and prosecution of heretics, empowering ecclesiastical courts with significant authority. Consider the Cathars in 13th century southern France. Their dualistic beliefs, which challenged fundamental tenets of Christian doctrine, were perceived as a monstrous threat, leading to the Albigensian Crusade. The systematic persecution and eradication of Cathar communities, sanctioned by both church and state, demonstrated the lengths to which medieval authorities would go to eliminate what they saw as religious pollution directly threatening God's grace. These laws, brutal as they were driven by a profound, if misplaced, conviction for collective salvation. They represent a society wrestling with its deepest fears, enacting extreme measures to protect its spiritual foundation. The whispers of heresy were understood not as mere dissent, but as an existential threat to the cosmic order and the very survival of the community under the watchful and sometimes terrifying fear of the divine. While the image of faith and fire conjures scenes of brutal repression, the laws against heresy and blasphemy were also deeply rooted in a profound sense of spiritual conviction and the medieval understanding of salvation. For the authorities, conformity was not merely about political control. It was a perceived act of mercy, aiming to guide lost souls back to the path of righteousness and ensure the collective spiritual welfare of the entire community through the soul's longing. The judicial processes of the Inquisition, often associated solely with torture and execution, were surprisingly meticulous in their record-keeping and aimed primarily at eliciting confession and repentance, not merely condemnation. Many individuals accused of heresy were given opportunities to recant their views, perform penance, and be reintegrated into the community, albeit under suspicion. Dr. Henry Charles Lee's extensive work on the Inquisition reveals the complex legal procedures, including interrogation, testimony, and even rudimentary forms of appeal, that underscored the Church's desire for reconciliation. The preferred outcome was always conversion, not conflagration. However, the threat of torture and the severity of final punishment were formidable tools. The torture methods, employed after the 13th century, were considered necessary evils to extract the truth from recalcitrant heretics, especially as heresy was believed to be a secret crime, difficult to prove through conventional means. The public spectacle of burning served to purify the heretic's soul, act as a deterrent to others, and reaffirm the Church's unwavering commitment to orthodox doctrine. It was a terrifying, yet logical extension of their belief system. Beyond formal legal proceedings, social pressure played a significant role in enforcing conformity. In a largely communal and deeply religious society, deviation from accepted beliefs could lead to social ostracism, economic hardship, and a profound sense of isolation. Preachers often condemned heresy in sermons, reminding the populace of the spiritual dangers and the importance of adhering to the one true faith. Village life, with its constant surveillance, ensured that any subtle deviation from orthodox practice would likely be noticed and reported. Ultimately, these laws, horrifying as they are to modern sensibilities, were born from a deeply held conviction in the absolute truth of Christian doctrine and the belief that eternal salvation for all depended on its preservation. They were a severe, yet, in their own context, rational response to challenges to the spiritual authority that underpinned all facets of medieval existence. The faith and fire that characterized the suppression of heresy reveals a society profoundly shaped by its soul's longing for certainty and collective spiritual purity, where the boundaries between religious dogma and social order were indistinguishable, and conformity was understood as an essential prerequisite for both earthly peace and heavenly reward. From the spiritual dictates of faith, we now transition to the temporal bonds that held medieval society together, the intricate system of feudalism. Imagine a world where rights, duties, and even land ownership were not abstract legal concepts, but personal relationships forged through oaths, ceremonies, and mutual obligations. These were the fundamental laws of vassalage, an unwritten yet powerfully binding social contract, and a complex web of loyalty that defined hierarchies and maintained order in a world without central bureaucracies or pervasive state power. Feudalism, particularly in the High Middle Ages, was the dominant socio-political and economic system across much of Western Europe. It was built upon a reciprocal relationship between a lord and his vassal. The laws governing this system were less formal legislation and more custom and tradition, codified over time through charters and court rulings. Dr. Susan Reynolds, a preeminent medieval historian, emphasizes that these bonds were deeply personal, involving homage, the vassal's submission to the lord, and fealty, the vassal's oath of loyalty and service. The core of this relationship was the fiefme, typically land, granted by the lord to the vassal. In return for the fief, the vassal pledged military service, counsel, and financial aid to his lord. This was a direct solution to a key medieval problem: how to raise and maintain an army and administer vast territories without a strong, centralized monetary economy. The vassal used the income from his fief to equip himself and his retinue, serving his lord directly. This oath of allegiance was therefore more than symbolic. It was a military and administrative contract critical for the functioning of kingdoms. However, the web of loyalty was rarely simple. Vassals could hold fiefs from multiple lords, leading to potential conflicts of interest. This gave rise to the concept of liege homage, where a vassal would pledge primary allegiance to one lord above all others. For example, a Norman baron might owe fealty to the Duke of Normandy for his lands there, but also to the King of England for his English holdings. If the Duke and King went to war, the baron's liege homage would determine where his primary military obligation lay. Breaching the oath of fealty was a grave offence, considered outright treason against one's lord. Punishments could range from forfeiture of the fief to imprisonment or even execution. The very stability of the realm depended on these oaths being largely upheld. While instances of rebellion and changing loyalties were common, the legal concept of fealty provided a framework for understanding and condemning such acts. These laws of vassalage, often unwritten and customary, reveal a medieval world attempting to construct order from personal relationships. They demonstrate a pragmatic approach to governance, where power flowed through a network of personal bonds rather than impersonal institutions. The web of loyalty was a complex, fragile, yet remarkably enduring system that shaped governance, warfare, and land ownership for centuries, laying the administrative and military groundwork for future nation-states. The feudal system, built upon the promises and peril of vassals and lords, was a pragmatic response to an era of endemic violence and political fragmentation. Far from an arbitrary imposition, the dynamic of submission in exchange for protection was a viable strategy for survival in a world where centralized state power was weak and personal security depended heavily on local alliances. The price of protection was high, but for many, it was the only means to endure. At its most fundamental level, feudalism offered a crude yet effective form of governance and defense. In the absence of professional standing armies, the vassal's military service formed the backbone of a lord's fighting force. Castles, built and maintained by vassals or their sub-vassals, dotted the landscape, providing local strongholds against raiders, rival lords, or foreign invaders. This localized defense was crucial for the peasantry who, though often tied to the land and subject to numerous obligations, found a measure of stability under the protection of their lord. The concept of suzerainty further complicated this web of loyalties. A king might be suzerain over his direct barons, who in turn were suzerains over their knights. This created a layered system where every individual, from peasant to king, theoretically owed fealty and received protection within the hierarchy. This system, though riddled with potential for conflict, provided a recognized framework for dispute resolution and the exertion of authority at various levels of society. However, the price of protection extended beyond military service. Vassals also owed various feudal incidents to their lords, including financial payments upon the inheritance of a fief, relief, contributions to the lord's ransom if captured, or aid for dubbing his eldest son a knight or marrying his eldest daughter. These obligations, while sometimes onerous, were understood as part of the reciprocal bargain that underpinned the entire system. The very ceremonial acts of homage and fealty served a crucial psychological and legal role. Performed publicly, often involving kneeling before the Lord and placing hands in his, these rituals cemented the personal, almost paternalistic nature of the bond. They were contracts made visible, reinforcing the mutual understanding of rights and responsibilities. Dr. Mark Bloch, a foundational historian of feudal society, emphasized the symbolic weight of these ceremonies in a largely illiterate age. Ultimately, the laws and customs of vassalage, though seemingly bizarre in their emphasis on personal bonds over abstract state power, were born of necessity. They were a sophisticated, if sometimes brutal, system for managing resources, raising armies, and maintaining a semblance of order in a fractured political landscape. They highlight a medieval world constantly seeking mechanisms for survival and stability, where promises and peril were woven into the daily fabric of existence, and the complex web of loyalty was the price for protection in a dangerous world. This foundational system, with its inherent contradictions, laid the groundwork for the future evolution of national states. From the dynamic contracts of feudal loyalty, we now turn to life's ultimate certainty, death. Imagine a time when not only your life, but your passage into the afterlife was governed by specific laws and customs, even down to the precise location of your final resting place. These were the laws surrounding burial, often dictated by the Church, that highlight the profound spiritual and social significance attached to the cold embrace of the earth in the Middle Ages, ensuring that even in death, one remained woven into the fabric of community and belief. In medieval Europe, death was not merely the end of life, it was a transition, a pivotal moment of spiritual reckoning. The Church held immense authority over burial practices, defining who could be buried where and with what rites. Dr. Philippe Ariès, a seminal historian of death in Western society, emphasizes that the primary concern was the salvation of the soul and the maintenance of religious order, making burial laws deeply intertwined with theological doctrine. The most basic distinction was between consecrated and unconsecrated ground. Burial in consecrated churchyards, or within the church itself, was the norm for Christians, signifying their inclusion in the community of believers and proximity to sacred relics. This was seen as crucial for the soul's passage to purgatory and eventual salvation. Those denied Christian burial, excommunicates, unbaptized infants, suicides, executed criminals and Jews, were cast out, buried in unconsecrated ground outside the churchyard, often in unmarked graves. This denial of last rites was a potent social and spiritual punishment, signifying eternal damnation according to popular belief. Desire for burial within the church itself, especially near the altar or a saint's tomb, was highly coveted, often involving significant financial bequests to the church. This practice, initially reserved for clergy and royalty, gradually extended to wealthy laypeople, creating a hierarchy of burial spaces within the sacred precinct. The more prominent the individual, the closer to the spiritual power they could be buried. This practice, while stemming from piety, also served as a visible manifestation of social status even in death, reflecting power dynamics that extended beyond life. Furthermore, specific laws often dictated the manner of burial. Funeral processions might be regulated, requiring certain prayers or liturgical formalities. Grave goods, while common in earlier periods, became less prevalent in the High Middle Ages as the Church placed more emphasis on spiritual salvation over material display. These laws governing burial were therefore far more than mere regulations of interment. They were powerful instruments of social control, spiritual solace, and communal identity. They ensured that every individual's passage from life was conducted according to prescribed rituals, reinforcing religious dogma, social order, and the collective understanding of life, death, and the hereafter. In an age deeply concerned with salvation, the cold embrace of the earth was a sacred space, meticulously governed to secure not just a final resting place, but a path to eternity. Beyond the legal and spiritual dictates, the laws surrounding medieval burial practices also reveal a profound human dimension. The management of grief, the expression of reverence, and the comforting, if sometimes desperate, unseen hand of hope. These seemingly rigid regulations offered a structured means for individuals and communities to process loss and maintain a connection with the departed, integrating death into the continuous cycle of life. The precise location of burial, for instance, had a direct impact on the grieving process. Being laid to rest in proximity to family members within the familiar churchyard provided a tangible link to one's lineage and community, reinforcing a sense of belonging even in death. For families, visiting the gravesite and knowing their loved ones were in consecrated ground, heard by the daily prayers of the local priest, offered immense solace. This is why denial of Christian burial was such a feared and devastating punishment. It severed this vital connection. Furthermore, the elaborate testamentary practices associated with death, although not strictly burial laws, were inextricably linked. Individuals, especially the wealthy, meticulously planned their post-mortem wishes, often leaving detailed instructions for their burial site, the type of coffin, the number of candles, and the feast to be held in their memory. These wills, testaments, also included numerous bequests to the church for prayers and masses to be said for their souls, and generous alms for the poor. As Dr. Caroline Walker Bynum notes, these acts of charity and piety were believed to reduce time in purgatory, a powerful incentive for the dying and their families. This financial aspect ensured the continued upkeep of churchyards and the spiritual services associated with them. The widespread practice of placing gravestones or memorial effigies, however simple or elaborate, also served a dual purpose. They marked the physical resting place, but more importantly, provided a constant visible reminder for the living to pray for the souls of the departed. These memorials, often adorned with inscriptions requesting prayers, by GG, ora pro nobis, pray for us, actively invited the living to participate in the spiritual journey of the dead. This collective prayer was a tangible expression of reverence and love, reflecting a deep-seated belief in the communion of saints and the efficacy of intercession. Ultimately, the laws and customs surrounding medieval burial underscore a profoundly spiritual and communal approach to death. They provided structure and meaning to the end of life, ensuring that even in the face of immense loss, there was a clear framework for remembrance, spiritual succor, and the perpetuation of hope for the afterlife. These regulations, far from being bizarre, were thoughtful responses designed to comfort the living, honor the dead, and affirm the eternal promise of faith in a transient world, demonstrating that even at life's end, the community's unseen hand of hope offered a final, comforting embrace.